Hello, everybody.
Hi.
How is everyone doing?
Doing great.
Perfect. I believe we're giving it maybe a minute or two more to see if more folks can join the stream. But once my team gives me the green light, we'll start the conversation. Sounds great? Perfect. Perfect. So I was given the green light to start the conversation. First of all, thank you all for taking some time to be a part of this conversation. Today, we're going to be talking about managing consultants and ensuring a successful working relationship. My name is Roberto Nava. I am a senior associate at Solidarity Strategies, a Latino consulting firm that we work in politics. We provide every service you can imagine to candidates. But yeah, I do not want to make any mistakes when it comes to names. So I want to give you guys the opportunity to present yourself. And I want to start with Amanda.
Yeah, I'm Amanda Ash. It is a tough one to pronounce. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But I'm Amanda Ash. I'm the digital director at Senate Majority PAC and work with a lot of consultants across the space, particularly on digital, but across all of them.
Perfect. Karen?
Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Defilippi. I am the head of television and digital at Berlin Rosen Campaigns. I joined the BR team just this year, and before that was at the DCCC Emily's List. So I have now a consultant, but both been on the other side of working with a lot of consultants. So have an interesting viewpoint.
Perfect. Artie, I believe.
Hello, Artie Blanco. I am currently with the National AFL-CIO. My background varies from the party committees as well as running my own operation in Nevada, winning elections and dealing with different types of consultants. And so definitely have some thoughts and views. But now in my role, I've been now with the AFL-CIO 12 years and have now been promoted. I'm now the National Campaigns Director and decided to move back to Washington, D.C. In order to do this role. So looking forward to the conversation.
Perfect. Ruiyong?
Hi. Hi, I'm Ruiyong Chen. I am the Senior Director of Paid Media at the Hub Project. I oversee our paid media efforts across campaigns and programs, as well as our longer-term learning agenda as it relates to program evaluation and measurement. I've been at the Hub for almost 5 years, and before that, I led the advertising team at Precision Strategies, where I worked on a mix of political and corporate work. Looking forward to chatting with everyone.
Perfect. Thank you very much. After introductions, we'll give around 10 to 15 minutes for each of the panelists to talk a little bit more in depth about their background, about the organization they work with. And after that, we'll jump to questions that we have prepared for the panel, but also we'll be taking questions from the audience as well. So I want to, what about we start again? How about Amanda? Can you go first?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So let's see. I'm at Senate Majority PAC. We run paid media programs across a bunch of targeted Senate battleground states. And last cycle, we ended up running about 9 different states. We're really proud of being just part of the effort to hold and expand our majority. And this cycle, looking to do it again. And one of the ways that we will do that is by partnering with a lot of great consultants across the space. So personally, I'm working with about 6 different digital consultants right now, and we build out consultant teams for each of our states. So we'll work with a media firm, a pollster, a mail firm, and a digital firm, for each of our states. And that, that relationship is a long one. We start pretty early. So, we went through our RFP process earlier this year, talked with a bunch of people across the space, and now are just sort of getting everyone up to speed. I think, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, part of it takes a lot of time to bring in consultants, get everyone acquainted, figure out how people work together, what the processes are going to be, what approvals are going to look like, what role everyone's going to play. So we're kind of in the middle of that right now, which I think is a lot of fun. I've been doing my little onboarding decks. I think I'm getting good at that presentation. So that's sort of a little background about what we've been working on. I know that wasn't 10 minutes, but I'm happy to talk more about any part of that.
No worries. That was more than useful. How about we go with Karen?
So I'm trying to think about where to start. So as I said, I sort of came to consulting this cycle after having spent a lot of time at committees, on campaigns, traveling the country. I think, one of the things I like to tell everyone, whether or not, it's sort of, if you're like at any point in your career, I think this is sort of wise advice or just helpful things to remember. It's, something my mom used to say to me, which is like, you make plans and God laughs. And every plan I've ever had in life has fallen apart, but it has gotten me to where I am today. So I had a plan to go to law school, and then I ended up on a campaign as a fluke in Iowa in 2008. And I found my people, and I absolutely love political campaigns. And then I had a plan to go to the Hill, and then someone called me and said, go to work on this campaign. So, but my, main history is a long stretch of campaigns on the road, a couple tours on Capitol Hill as a staffer and as a chief of staff, and then, leading the political programs at EL and the DCCC before doing this. So I have a lot of kind of, consumer end experience with consultants. What brought me into consulting, and particularly into TV, is the ability to tell stories. And I think, there's a lot of different types of consultants, and really excited to answer your questions about how you can best manage them, how you can sort of set up boundaries, how you can get the best work product out of them, how you can get them to work really well as a team. And they provide a variety of services and value to your races or to your campaigns and your causes. But I think one of those is telling candidate stories. And I think that at the core of that is what we do, and what can make us stronger as a Democratic Party, because facts and figures matter a little bit, but how you make people feel really matters the most. And I think about the constituencies where we need to move the needle as a party. And I think that there is a lot that we're still missing in terms of connecting with people's hearts and feelings, right? And addressing their fears and their anxieties. And we are so genuinely the better party. I want to communicate those things to voters in a really powerful way. So that's what brought me into consulting. And I'm having a great time, and really excited to just talk to you all about how you get the best out of consultants.
Thank you for sharing, Karen. Artie?
Yeah, thanks. So since I've been with the AFL-CIO for the last 12 years in different iterations, I think in my perspective in terms of consultants is understanding the different variants of consultants and how holding them accountable, and especially to constituencies that we need to do work. There are lots of consultants, and as those of us that have run actual in-state programs, that say, this is my opinion, this is based on what I've got on a in the beltway kind of piece. But I always feel, and one of the things that if I'm spending money, and how are we holding consultants accountable, is to also understand the real root of what voters really think and the one-on-one conversations that are happening in the field. So for me and for programs that we've run, we're very much centered around our membership in terms of the programs that we have and those one-on-one conversations that we have in state. Different states have different messaging, different feels, especially for us in the labor movement. Our membership is vast. It is different. We have different sectors. And so sometimes reminding consultants that we are looking towards and that we work with, they need to understand who that audience is. And sometimes we ourselves have to be that person to push back to say, you need to come and actually listen. We always look for, especially consultant in different projects, when we are trying to connecting the issues that we're currently talking about with, whether it's our membership or with voters in general in particular areas, even if you're doing nonprofit work, connecting those issues and how you talk about it with voters. There's a thing about testing messages through polling, through focus groups. That's a start. But the messaging nuanced and the changes in messages really comes from actually testing it on the ground, face to face, not just in a research capacity. And so what I always say is this new generation of campaigners, campaign managers, if you are looking to increase your skills, you cannot forget the basics of actual communication, and how are you working with consultants that have been around a long time that are still thriving because they understand it is also about connecting with folks that are closest to the voters that you're trying to convince or move, however you're doing that. And so when we work with consultants, me personally, running a $4 million program in a specific state that is both persuasion, that is both GOTV, that is all the things to get a state over the line, you've got to take all that into consideration and holding consultants accountable. How do you do that? Communication, constantly in communication and lifting up, what are the things that we're hearing from the ground? I always like to say to consultants, you should ask your clients, how are you debriefing with people that are talking to voters in your district? What is working? What is not working? These are the things that we need to make sure that they are connected with people actually talking to voters. So for me, this is what I'm bringing to this conversation. I feel very strongly, as you can probably tell, about this because I've dealt with different types of consultants throughout the years of my career. And there are some that you could tell get it, and there are some that really still stay in this consultant box. So how do you identify those? That's probably going to be some of the questions that may come through. So thank you. I hope that's just a start.
Thank you for that. That was amazing. Ruiyong?
Yeah, I can ad-lib a little bit. So I have a bit of an inverse story to Karen's. So I've been at the Hub for almost 5 years. For those that don't know, the Hub Project is a nonprofit issue advocacy organization that focuses on issues of democracy, reproductive justice, and economic justice. So we've done Senate work for the last couple of cycles, but we're back to focusing on the House this year, or the last year or two, the cycle across 20-ish districts. Prior to my current role on the client side, if you will, I was doing a mix of corporate and political on the agency side. So worked with like a diverse roster of clients there. Right now, we're working with about 20 or so consultant teams across our paid media programs. That's digital, TV, mail, and we're spending about 40 mil or so this cycle. But looking forward to chatting more about all the things that related to like how to make it work better, how to hold folks accountable, and all that.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to pass to ask a couple of questions. It could be a collective answer, if you guys can all come together and do an answer, obviously one at a time. And then I would like to try something different at the end, and maybe one of you can give, after questions, like a key advice, and then we can end with that. So the first question that I have is, when starting a relationship with a consultant, for you, what is key from the beginning that needs to be said, either in a meeting or by paper, to ensure clear expectations for a successful client consulting relationship? And whoever wants to go first, go ahead, please.
I'm happy to hop in. So I think there's like two ways to sort of think about this question. And I think the first is not to sound like overly technical, but you should always have a contract when you hire consultants. And I think, it's remarkable the number of times campaigns don't do that. And if you're ever in the position of running a campaign or organization, like, you should have a contract on everything, mostly because it's professional. It formalizes the relationship. It's also where you would realize if there was a hidden fee that you didn't know about, right? It would outline the terms. It's also where you can like maybe clear up things early on in the process of like who's placing the OTT buy. Is it the television firm or is it the digital firm, right? Like that's like, there's actually a lot of sometimes utility to contracts, but it's also just a way to, I think, set the tone and be professional about everything. So I think that's important on the front end. I also think it's important on the front end with a consultant, and I think this burden should be on the consultant, is to get to know your client really well. And I think that sort of sounds basic, but what I think we're really lucky that, Artie and Rihanna and Amanda are here because they can speak a lot about this from the org space, but I love candidates. So I speak a lot about candidate work, right? But when I'm working with a new candidate in particular, I find a reason to call them at least once a week after they launch their campaign, right? Just because it's like, what's going on, just checking in on them. And that's where you sort of learn some flavor to their family, or the things that are worrisome to them, or the things that are happening in their district that probably never get put on a weekly call with the consultants. And that is also where you can sort of very quickly build that rapport that you are someone that they can call when they're in trouble, because that's how you truly understand what's going on with them. And I think with a campaign. And then, very often you hire consultants and then you don't really do anything with them that requires payment or product for a while. When I get to the point of, okay, you hired me 3 months ago and now we're going to do some paid communications together, I usually find time to call the campaign manager or whoever else is the sort of decision maker and walk them through again what the process would be and say like, hey, I know it's been a while since we've chatted about process, but now that we're getting into, paid communications, we're going to talk about the shoot. This is what you can expect from me in the shoot. This is what you'll expect in terms of approval timelines and what we're going to need for approval. And that's also a good opportunity for them to ask questions, because sometimes the questions that they have are things I would have never maybe thought that they would have had, or things I thought they would have known or maybe weren't worried about. So I think the kind of expectation setting can sort of happen in two phases, because I think if, you sometimes do that paid, a lot of those details around approvals and turnaround time on things, if you're not actually doing it for 6 months, everyone's going to forget it, right? And like the managers are not going to remember, what you need to get sign off or when you need to actually wire the funds. Like they will have forgotten that. So I do expectation setting early on. And then my other really focus early on is like, and I think it should be on the consultant. And if you have a consultant who you hire and then you don't ever proactively hear from them, I think that's kind of a flag and something you should think through.
Yeah, I think, coming at it from the org side, where kind of you're bringing consultants into an operation that's kind of already going. I think one of the, like you mentioned, expectations, and obviously I strongly agree with Karen on the contract. So important to have that ironed out and have like all those little questions, the commission, all that stuff figured out up front, so you're not dealing with that stuff as you're trying to move. But I think one other thing that we've done that I think is really helpful is, in addition to a contract and a discussion of expectations, is just a discussion of best practices. There's a lot of, I mean, especially on the digital side right now, there's a lot of people doing it a lot of different ways. And so getting on the same page with your consultant early on, that this is how we're thinking about it, this is before you even get into the strategy of the race or anything, that, this is how we think stuff should be bought. This is how we want it to be shown to us, all that kind of stuff. I think has been a really helpful tool for us, and just starting those relationships in a really good place and feeling like we're kind of on the same page. I think the other thing is, and again, to kind of add to what Karen said, like, you'll bring people on months in advance before you start spending. And so starting to have regular calls before you need them, like, sometimes can feel like a little bit of a waste of time, but even if you're just checking in for 5 minutes a week, it helps to build the rapport. And I agree. I really look to my consultants to kind of figure out how to work with us. But I think on the client end, also want to be helpful to the consultant and set them up for success. And so that, I think it's a two-way street there in terms of building that communication and that rapport early.
I'm just going to double down on what Amanda just said about rapport. To me, that is so important, because if you are talking about, and there's different types of consultants we're talking about, right? You could be hiring somebody for 6 weeks just to get you started because you need help with thinking through program, thinking through different components that they can bring to the table. And so really having that rapport early on, that they understand your ultimate vision, your ultimate goals, and truly setting out what those expectations are earlier rather than later is best. Throw all the cards on the table, flip them all over. And Karen for sure touched on having a contract. It doesn't, if you're hiring someone that's like a friend for a few months, trust me, she is right. Contracts and really laying things out in writing is going to be important. So rapport, definitely contract, timeline, expectations, and what you expect them. There are times when you're running program or whatever that you are running your program pieces, and you don't have time to check in on consultants. They are self-starters. They should be checking in with you, and you have to set that standard early on. So definitely thinking about those items. That also is just helpful in determining whether or not they're going to work right for the project. So that's just important in general. So that's kind of the things that when you're on the onset, and it may not just be one conversation, right? Sometimes, depending on the organization that you're working with, there's a committee of folks that are making a decision on a consultant. It's not going to be one conversation. It may not just be two conversations, to really for them to understand what your ultimate goals and expectations are. So just keeping that in mind, putting everything in writing, laying everything out. Do not assume, because you just got to make sure you're on the same page. So those are kind of my key points that I look for.
Double click on what everyone else has said. I think the only two things I would add are that I feel like folks touched on this a little bit, but I feel like onboarding a consultant is very much like onboarding a new staffer on your team. And I think we want to make sure that, we're all rowing in the same direction and that we're giving as much information as we can so that they can be there to do the job that they were hired to do, with as much knowledge and expertise and context as possible. I think on the expectations front, that is so important. I feel like one thing that has been helpful for us as well is to make sure that we set expectations internally as well. I think a lot of folks who are not maybe so directly involved in the consultant hiring just need to make sure that we set expectations with internal stakeholders as well, to make sure we understand the goal for why they're doing that work. Especially, I think sometimes also aligning on whether or not it's an execution type role versus a more consultative role. I think sometimes we can trip ourselves up if, you know, somebody is like, oh, I already have a very specific vision for what we want them to do. I think especially with, I feel like with digital firms more so than I would say with like a TV media consultant, but just making sure that everybody knows sort of how we're going to make decisions and how we're going to make things happen is important too.
Can I add one more thing? Something that just triggered for me as well was what happens if they don't meet a deadline? Like there has to be, you know, some things happen, but you have to make sure that if someone doesn't hit a deadline, what does that mean? So always think about those potential contingencies as well. Setting that straight. That just popped in my head. Sorry.
No worries. That was very helpful. You know, we're talking about kind of best practices, you know, what needs to be set in place. Obviously, we're talking about contracts, deadlines, meeting expectations. Could you speak a little bit about those back practices that you have seen in the industry, either by personal experience or by, you know, hearing from others?
Yeah, I've got some. Yeah, I actually, you know, had something that we learned some lessons from. I think one bad practice is a really big upfront payment. You know, even people can come to the table with the best intentions and really want to deliver for you, and sometimes it just doesn't work and they can't. And when you're locked in, like it's already hard to make a change, but when you have to fight to like get your money back, it's a tough spot to be in, and it makes making a change much harder than it, you know, has to be. So I think in terms of that's like a worse practice, in my opinion. And then I think the other thing is, you know, as a consultant, like I really appreciate when people are willing to make adjustments. And I find, you know, when I'm in a place where I'm giving the same feedback over and over, or we say, okay, this isn't working, can you bring us a new plan that like incorporates this? And the consultant comes back and says, no, we're right. This is like, we can do this. Like, we don't have to make any changes. That to me is a big red flag. And it usually means it's not going to work because no one is right all the time, including me. So that's another kind of point I found.
Any additional comment on that, or can we move to another question?
Yeah, Amanda, I didn't actually know how to answer that question at first because I couldn't think of things. And then as Amanda was talking, I was like, oh yeah, and that, and that, and that, and like horror stories like flashed through my mind. I think like the consultants that are just like, well, no, I'm correct. It's like, well, maybe you are, but by whose standards? And like, this is why we have a team. And, you know, I think that like sort of along those lines, you know, what often drives me crazy is, and I think something like I'm really like conscious of is when, you know, I have been working on a race and you kind of realize that the scripts went from the consultant to the candidate, or like the consultant and the candidate and the manager, and like literally nobody else saw them. Like the pollster didn't see them, the direct mail consultant didn't see them. And it is like clear, like they don't want feedback, right? And I shouldn't just say like that's like media, like lots of folks do that, right? Or, you know, you get a poll draft and the pollster says, oh, well, you know, the candidate already signed off on this. And you're like, oh. So what, like, it doesn't really give you, I think at that point, they either are moving too quickly and weren't kind of organized enough to like allow time for feedback, or they don't want it for whatever reason. And whatever that reason is, like, I don't feel like it's usually a good one. And I think that it's particularly when you're talking about paid communications programs that should be smart and layered and matching. How, if like the rest of the team can't even weigh on scripts, then how are we sure that like drop dates are aligning with new ad traffic and things like that? So I just like, that's the other big one is, and I think that can be a really, really hard place for managers or people running program to be in, is taking someone's work product and like forcing it into a feedback chamber, which I think is, you know, going back to expectations and onboarding is something that is probably easier done when you just say it at the outset, that that's the expectation you would have.
I had a similar experience just now where I didn't have any good ideas. And then as Karen was talking, I did come up with a few. I think, honestly, a lot of times it's trying to sort of hide the football a little bit, whether that is in terms of fees, when, you know, you're looking at a media plan and they're like tacking on fees that are like in the net costs, but aren't included elsewhere. I think that's a little bit, I'd rather just know, obviously, you know, ad serving or whatever, those are all costs that have to be paid. But I think it's just better to be more upfront about what those additional fees are, so that you're not it doesn't feel like you're trying to pad your commission. I think that, you know, we're all human, so there will be mistakes in the running of a campaign. I think an ideal scenario is obviously if somebody has made a mistake that, you know, they call me, right? I think sometimes it's happened where I've had to, you know, be the one to like find out what happened, and it turned out that they knew about it for a few days. And I think that is an unfortunate place to be from a relationship perspective and from sort of just the work itself.
Perfect. And thank you. And as we move on, we're going to be receiving some questions from the audience. And the first one is from Kermit Thomas. It says, it feels like the big upfront payment are more necessary for some of the smaller, newer startup firms. Do you all have any suggestion for candidates and campaigns who do want to work with some of the newer consulting orgs that will need more money upfront? That a difficult one to answer?
Yeah, I mean, I would make it crystal clear in that contract exactly what happens, and you know, I would also try to figure out maybe a payment plan that's more front loaded, but isn't like a full sum up front. But like the most important thing I think is like to have that written out as a plan. You know, what happens if this goes south, and a way to kind of hold them accountable.
I feel like there's a way to also, I think, you know, sometimes newer firms or firms who've just started out will want to, you know, like prepay for a shoot, right? And I think that is totally reasonable. I think we just need to obviously know in advance for that. But I think for media itself, I think, you know, just breaking it out into like, maybe we place like monthly or something. I think it's just not, it's rarely, I think, a good idea, even if we feel totally rock solid about the relationship, to just like wire out like 8 months of the media budget, right? Because a lot of things are going to change. We probably don't want to place that far in advance anyway. And I think there's a lot of other reasons besides, you know, it just being a little bit messy on the relationship side. So I feel like we've rarely run into issues where I think consultants have been like, oh, I definitely need all of the money up front. And that's usually, I think, to Amanda's point, a bit of a red flag too.
Perfect. Oh, there we go. We have another question from Stephen Prophet. He says, what aspects, categories of your org's activities are handled in-house, and which ones are most often contracted out to consultants?
I can start with this one. We contract most things out. I mean, I think especially like polling, that gets contracted out. Most, if not all of the paid media for us does. We don't do any buying in-house. I think there's a lot of advantages in contracting that out. Firms that, you know, do this day in, day out, that have the advantage of running other programs too, and can like bring in additional knowledge in terms of how you're doing those buys. So we contract all of that out, contract out a lot, most of the creative. Sometimes that can be harder. I think that's where you really have to be in alignment with your consultant on the vision and the messaging and the tone and the branding and the vibe, all of it. But yeah, we contract that out as well. In-house, we do a little bit of creative, but I think, yeah, most of it gets contracted out.
Can I just say, I think sometimes when it comes to creative and placing media buys, or I should say like placing media, because that like could mean everything from television ads to like even like direct mail, right? There's sometimes a vibe from candidates of like, we can do this, right? And it is almost certainly harder than they think it is, right? And like having a friend who can like make a video is not the same as a firm that specializes in doing that, even from the technical things of like, oh, if you use someone and they're wearing this, you have to have this type of, or what is the federal disclaimer, or what's the format that the ad needs to be in to ship to the stations. And like, there's that side of it. It's also kind of the expertise and I think like knowledge of what makes effective creative. But, if it is polling or producing and placing a buy, and I say buy, but that could again be like mailing direct mail. I don't do direct mail, but I know enough about it to know that like I don't know how to do it, right? Like that's right. So I think that's like the important part is like you really like push back on your candidate if that is ever their inclination, because it will not only be probably a waste of your resources, it will be way more time than you think, and it will ultimately not be effective. And most of the time when campaigns go down that route, they get halfway down and then call somebody in a panic. And that time is better spent raising money and talking to voters.
Thank you for that. Let me see if we have another question. I believe they should be popping up. If not, I have a question. We have noticed that obviously the consulting world is becoming more diverse with the times, and that's obviously a great thing. But how do you manage when it comes to wanting, and you hire a series of consultants, some people hire lesser, but how do you strike a balance between being having a diverse group of consultants, but also managing specializing in certain services?
I'll just say, I think on this piece, it really does look, you want more diverse consultants, so you need to expand where you can identify where those folks are if you don't already know. Asking the questions, really working with network to identify who they are. But honestly, like when I'm making decisions on consultants, I want people that have a little bit of a proven record, or that also I can see what experiences and what they've been able to engage on. But I know it's a challenge, but folks are out there. Like more and more, the diversity in this space has grown tremendously. From my first rounds of doing national political work and in the consultant sphere, it is growing out there. And I think really working and depending on your networks to identify, but then also really need to make sure that you're still looking at what they've been able to accomplish. And even them as a person, they may have had different pieces that push them into that consulting space. Even if they're new to consulting, you already know whether or not they really understand, depending on what you're looking for, if they have the experience or the chops to be able to do it. And that's why, to me, like, rapport is important. Do they understand what are they in line with your vision? Are they in line with the goals, whatever the consulting work actually is? Whether I know we're doing a lot of digital media heavy kind of conversation here, but like all the other different spaces where you would want to hire a consultant, I think it just really is branching out. There are many out there, and work through those networks like the gain power, right? And identifying where those folks are. So opening it up.
I think everything Artie said is totally right. I also think the best way to ensure you have a team that is reflective of your candidate, your organization's mission, or your like district, right, is also about like having a process and doing a process in a uniform fashion, right? Like, you know, I think where sometimes teams sort of hit hiccups is they do things in a vacuum maybe, and they think, well, like, you know, I kind of like that person, but I can get this on the next thing. And then if you sort of hire your full team at once, that is the best way, I think, to ensure that it is reflective, because you're able to evaluate all of your options at once, which I think is an important part of it. And it's, you know, also something we haven't touched on too, but I think it's the job of consultants to work well with each other, and sometimes they don't. You know, you could sometimes like tell when you're thinking about a team, you're like, oh, this might not be the right team, right? Because that's what it is. It's a team of people, right? So I think in addition to making sure it's a diverse and well-rounded and well-reflected team, it's also a team that you think is going to work well together with you and bring the right energy that you're trying to collaborate. So the best way to do that is to have a thorough and fair process and do it all at once. Like, don't hire your pollster and then like 3 months later hire your media consultant. Like, if you do it all at once, you'll have more options.
And I have a question regarding timing. Obviously, once you're getting closer to election, you would want to have all your consultants ready a couple months before. But when it is too early, and when it is too late to have your full team of consultants?
I think it's never too early.
It's never too early. That's a great advice. So now, as we prepare ourselves to close this amazing conversation, I want you guys to imagine that your best friend just got promoted to a position, and she's going to be managing consultants, and you can give her one tip over the phone. What would be your favorite tip to give to your friend? And we can start with Ruiyong.
I mean, I feel like everyone had such good ideas about setting expectations and building rapport. I might say that your relationship with your consultant is not static, that it will evolve over time and is dynamic. And so I think building in like mechanisms to check in over the course of an engagement is important. So that you're not just talking through sort of the day-to-day and your like weekly or however sort of regular cadence calls, but that you're also setting aside time to sort of do either more of a deep dive or just like more of like a one-on-one check-in to make sure that if there are adjustments or changes that we need to make, that we set aside the time to do that.
Perfect. Amanda?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in my mind, I was thinking about it as someone who's going to hire consultants and bring them on. And I think the advice I would just have is to find people that you want to work with and can trust. There's a lot of flashy pitches out there. And I mean, there's a lot of people who are doing a lot of work, but this is the person you're going to pick up the phone and call. This is the person you're going to just have to trust their advice. You get going and you don't have time to second guess everything. So making sure that you are bringing on people who, at the end of the day, you do trust and feel like you can be a team with. It's really important.
Perfect. Artie?
Sorry. Agree with what the sisters have shared.
Karen?
I think just to like build on what Amanda said is remember that they work for you, and you are obviously hiring them because of their expertise, and you should follow that, and you should let them bring that expertise and really guide you, and also know that sometimes it's like not your job as the manager to like know all the things. It's okay to ask questions. But I think as much as this industry is getting more and more diverse, that's a great thing. It's still really sometimes, not this panel, but pretty male dominated. And I still see a lot of consultants that, particularly with certain managers, like just run over them and don't always give them the space to lead and grow, and don't always give their questions, when they ask questions, sort of the respect that I think they deserve as the client, even if it seems like a simple question to them. And I have seen like managers sort of like feel like they're taking a step back and maybe not leading the campaign in a way that's really helpful to their professional growth, or not speaking up when they do have a perspective as the people on the ground, like living in the district, like spending every day with the candidate, because they are feeling intimidated by their team. And I think that can be a really kind of hard place, but you have to try to find your way to like taking ownership or kind of taking leadership of the team, which really goes back to Amanda's smart point, which is that you should trust them. And if you feel like, if you get that vibe from them and like when you're talking to them, like that might not be a right fit for you.
Perfect. Thank you. From my end, I don't have any more questions, and we don't have any more questions from the audience. I think this finalizes our panel. I want to be gracious with all of you and give some time back. We know that it's going to be a busy year, so we all have a lot to do. But yeah, it was an amazing conversation, and hopefully we can have more of this. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Thank you. You too.
Oh.